Today I'm talking with Elle Gibbs. Elle Gibbs is the Manager, Media and Campaigns for People with Disability Australia. She's an award-winning writer about disability and other social issues, published widely. Elle was elected to the Blue Mountains City Council in New South Wales in 2008 and served until 2012. During that time, she also served as the Director on the Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils, one of the broad regional groupings in the Sydney area, made up of 10 Western Sydney councils, including 1 year on the executive. Welcome, Elle Gibbs.
Hi, Christina. How are you?
Well, I'm good, and thanks so much for spending time with us today.
My absolute pleasure.
I want to know how you got into activism and, getting out there as a disabled person doing activism stuff.
I've been involved for a long time. I think I first became sick when I was 19, and I'm now comfortably middle-aged. So my disability has always been very public, and so from the very get-go, people always had a very strong reaction to how I looked, and I encountered significant barriers in terms of the differences between myself and my peers. And I've always had a very strong sense of fairness. And so I was that little kid stamping her feet and going, it's not fair. And I'm still that little kid stamping her feet and going, it's not fair. So, my activism around disability, though, it took me about 10 years, I think, until my late 20s, when I first kind of came across the social model of disability and started to think more about the structural barriers that I was facing, rather than thinking about it just as me as an individual. So for a long time, I blamed myself, and I was very harsh on myself. I probably still am, and very harsh on my own expectations of myself and what I could do. And I completed university as a person with disability, including doing some of it by correspondence when I lived literally 500 metres from the university. So I sort of pushed my way into the access things that I needed to complete my degree, but it was very difficult. And throughout that time, I blamed myself a lot of the time for when I couldn't complete things or things didn't work, rather than feeling comfortable talking about the more structural aspects. So I think coming to understand the social model of disability and how structural issues impact on structural discrimination, particularly impact on me as a person with disability, really framed my activism then, in terms of, rather than constantly trying to drive myself to do better or to thinking of myself as the problem, it became really clear that the problem was, a lot of the time external, and that those were the barriers that were stopping me from being able to do what I wanted to do.
Yeah. So how have you always been kind of disability focused, or what's taken you into the mainstream?
No, definitely not. So, I mean, I've been involved in all sorts of different activism around healthcare for young people, housing. Housing's always been a particular focus of mine. I started working in the community sector in my early 20s. So I've been sort of part of that sector for 25 years now. And that certainly has framed me. I've been a feminist since I can remember. So those kind of values have always been really important to me. And the community sector has been a place where I have found much more flexible work. So it's suited both my values and my disability, to be frank, around finding jobs where I could do a values-based job, 21 hours a week, for example, was really important to me as someone who wanted to work in an area that supported my passion for, improving things, but also actually, gave me an income and the flexibility and the understanding that I needed as a person with disability. So for a lot of the time, I look quite different. And so having employers and an employment environment where that's not a problem. Whereas in corporate land, I've been told repeatedly that the way I look is significantly problematic, and I would never get employment in a corporate environment. So some of my activism is kind of as a result of my disability, but some of it is also, I think, just part of who I am. My mum says I've been like this since I was a little kid, and but my activism around disability really developed as I got older, and certainly by the time I was in my early 30s, I had really focused on disability activism, things around healthcare and access to facilities and treatment. And I did a lot of activism around my particular disease, and did a lot of kind of lobbying and going to visit politicians when you look like I do, and when I'm sick, and all of those kind of things. And I did, was on national television for a couple of years in a row doing stuff. Never, thank God, before the era of social media. So I did a lot of that kind of stuff. But then I got involved in politics properly in 2007. So 10 years ago.
And what led you there? Why did you think politics was a thing to do?
Well, I was very frustrated. So throughout the Howard years, I'm a fairly progressive person, and that's no surprise. I had done a lot of campaigning around refugees and around climate change and around that kind of stuff. And I felt very frustrated, and I felt the need to do something. And in the years, particularly in the early 2000s, I was completely housebound for quite a long time, like I think 3 or 4 years. And I was what they called at the end of treatment options. So I had home care and home nursing and those kind of things. Thank God for the internet, because so it's when I started writing and doing those kind of things. But then when I got a bit better and I was a bit more able to get out and about, I really strongly felt like I wanted to do more and to be more involved. And it was fairly random, to be honest. I had joined the Greens, but hadn't really done anything about that. I hadn't kind of gone to meetings or done anything. I just kind of done it. And then they advertised for a job doing desktop publishing in a state election campaign. And I decided to go for it because that's kind of what I did for a living at the time. And I didn't get the job. And I was kind of like, oh, well, that's really disappointing. And they said to me, would you think about applying for the media job? And I kind of went, really? Yeah, are you sure? And they went, yeah. And I went, okay. And I got it. And so then I was plunged into kind of 15-hour days and working on election campaign. And then I was asked to come back and work on the following federal elections. So it was a kind of 18 months of working solidly on 2 election campaigns, and I learnt a lot, and it was very intense, but it was also a time when my illness was mostly in remission, and so it was a very strange time. It was kind of like coming out of a very long period of being very housebound and very sick, and into a period of being kind of among all these other activists and people running around. And it was a very different environment. But it was I learned a lot, and it was a very interesting place to be. And it felt like I was doing something or contributing something useful.
And was that when, you mentioned a federal campaign, and, federal and state politics are quite party political, aren't they? And particularly the big parties. And was that the point when you thought, well, maybe I'll have a go at doing this myself?
Oh, no, not really. It was more like the 2007 federal election was a real watershed in Australian politics, and it was an extremely exciting time to be part of all of that. And I certainly hadn't thought about going into politics myself. I was absolutely not keen on doing that. And when I came back to the mountains and then got another job, and when the elections were over and I went back to regular work and doing all of that stuff, I continued campaigning and being politically active. We did a big campaign in New South Wales around power privatisation. And so we did a really lovely local campaign that brought together all the political parties in one, kind of group, and we kind of had community charters about energy, and we did all sorts of exciting things. It was great fun to do. But that was what I was interested in. I certainly wasn't interested in being a politician or being in the spotlight or anything like that. I found all of that very uncomfortable and didn't want to do that.
So how did you do it? I mean, because it's only within 12 months from there that you ended up in the local council. So why on earth, Elle Gibbs, did you do this?
Yes, indeed. That is the question, Christina. But look, I was running the local government campaign. So I was running the campaign for the Greens up here to be elected to the local government. The Greens had already had a couple of councillors in previous years, so we had a presence on council. And at the sort of very close to the deadline, one of the candidates pulled out, had to pull out. And so I kind of thought, well, look, I'm, I don't have kids, I don't even have a cat, like it's, if I'm not prepared to do it, it's very difficult for me to ask somebody else to do it. I didn't actually expect to get elected, and I hadn't even lived up here for 2 years, so I really didn't, and 18 months of that had been spent in Sydney working on election campaigns. So I didn't really know much about the community or the issues or anything like that, and I was woefully underprepared. But anyway, I put my hand up to be the candidate, and I got elected in spades. So it was there was a kind of green wave across New South Wales, and 75 of us got elected as local government councillors in that year, which was a record. And I certainly wasn't the only one who was quite unprepared for it at the time. Yeah, but yes, it was a very big shock, and I certainly didn't expect to get elected. But yes.
It's interesting actually, and I was interested in what brought you into local government. But the other thing that's a feature of local government in Australia is that it's a lot less party political. I mean, the parties are in there, but it's also much more possible to get elected as an independent or as somebody who's from some fringe party. So it's how did that kind of influence you being a member of a party, and you're then in a situation where it's not about you, it's actually you representing the party platform. You've got the party's policies and the party's commitment to certain things. And so how do you actually work that stuff? How do you make sure that you're fulfilling their expectations of representing their voice?
Look, it's certainly on that year, the council ended up being 3 Labor, 3 Liberal, 3 Greens, 3 Independents. So it kind of was a really interesting mix. I think in New South Wales, we've maybe had a bit more history of party political engagement with local government. There's certainly, in the last 10 years, that's certainly been more of the case, and there's much fewer independents than there used to be. Certainly, look, so there's another part of the story that we'll get to in a second, but certainly having to advocate for the party's platform wasn't hugely problematic for me, because I mostly was, on board with the kinds of things that were part of that. I quite liked the Greens in New South Wales as kind of the theory of the way that the Greens are meant to work here, which is a level of accountability for elected Greens to local groups and to local members. And I quite like that. I thought that was a good model of how you can organise that sort of stuff, but I found the reality much different. And it certainly was sometimes difficult to marry the kind of expectations of the local group and local government. So, but quite often, like, I was pretty lefty, and so that's fine. It wasn't too much of an issue in terms of the Greens platform as such, but council and local government issues can be incredibly complex, and so trying to engage around those in a party political way can sometimes be problematic, because often party political communications can be of necessarily a bit more simplistic, and sometimes issues were more complex. But basically, I just kind of boiled things down to first principles. Like, public ownership is a good idea. It's good to have things that the community owns, and it's not a good idea to sell them, for example. Like, that's a reasonably simple idea for a progressive person to have. And so that applied to things like, I would vote against council's sale of council land some of the time, if it was, or I would vote against council holding hearings in secret, for example. So I, believed in transparency, those kind of things. So I would take it to first principles in terms of thinking that stuff through. But it certainly was a tension and difficult, and I was very involved in the Greens at the same time. So I was the I was the New South Wales Secretary of the Greens, and I was the permanent delegate to the Australian Greens. So what that meant was that, well, being New South Wales Secretary is fairly obvious, but what it meant for a national conference context was that I was the lead delegate for all of the National Council and Conference, that which is the way the Australian Greens makes decisions across the states and with the party room. So that's the senators and now lower house MPs. So I was very, very involved with the Greens at a state and national level, and I certainly think that impacted on my what I did at a local government level as well. So where I wanted to do some state or national things that possibly weren't as important as some of the local stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting because what you're describing there, just, correct me if I'm wrong, is, you're elected by a particular space within the council area. So they're called wards, aren't they? So that's the sort of electorate. So you're elected by the people in that space. They're the ones who actually voted for you and put a number in your box. Then you've actually got the party platform, the policies of the Greens. Then you're also in another representative role where you're representing the New South Wales Greens in the national party sphere. And so you're kind of being you've got three different representative roles all wrapped into the same person at the same time.
Yes, it was not easy. And then partly also because I was on WESROC, which is the Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils. I was the first Green elected to WESROC, and each council gets 2 delegates, which are their councillors, and then I was elected to the executive as part of a deal around giving Labor the presidency of WESROC. So I was quite happy to do that and support, but I had the casting vote, as it turned out. So I became the environmental spokesperson for WESROC for Western Sydney. So we did quite a lot of work of going to Canberra and lobbying various MPs and parliaments and various government bodies and stuff about the needs of Western Sydney. So I also was doing that at the same time, and so yes, it was a very busy period of time, and those kind of tensions remained. But I think for me, it always was an honour to serve on my council and to be in that role in my community. And as I went on, I very much saw my role as not translating the council, like translating the processes for people, and to make it as easy as possible for people to engage with council's decision making. I got involved in campaigns that I didn't particularly believe in or care about, but I knew that my community did. So that, for example, there was lots of concerns about a mobile phone tower in one part of the community, and I didn't particularly have thoughts one way or another about the mobile phone tower as such. But what I did worry about was that there was a very disadvantaged part of my ward, and that community didn't have the same kinds of access to power or to decision makers as other communities. So that the way that both the telecommunications companies but also the government agencies had behaved was pretty appalling, and had treated that community much differently than they would have treated a more well-off community. So that's part of why I went into bat for them and did that, rather than caring about the issues as a whole. I don't care. But that kind of stuff was much more became my focus later on in my term.
It's sounding to me like, if you've got this multiplicity of representative roles, you're representing, you've named about half a dozen different kind of organs of politics at the same time. Is there really a need in these circumstances that, you personally need to be aligned with what's going on? So, I think, we've talked about refugee policy, and what we actually know is that there's a lot of people in major political parties here and now today who don't necessarily agree with the refugee policy of their party, and yet they have to go out and advocate for it. But what I'm hearing from you is that kind of conflict is less and less possible when you're actually covering that multiplicity of roles. You really do need to be a single person with a single kind of outlook and to be able to be comfortable so that you're switching between.
Yes. And that all came to a head when I resigned from the Greens. So when that was no longer possible, and it wasn't about the local stuff, it was about state and federal stuff, and it was about some internal things, and it meant that it became no longer possible for me to feel ethically that I could be a public representative of the Greens while I was so at odds with the rest of the party. And finding decisions that were being made at a state and a federal level profoundly problematic. And so that was my main reason why I ended up leaving the Greens and doing the rest of my term as an independent, because I couldn't ethically stand up and be a public Green when I was so at odds with that. And I didn't feel either comfortable either pretending in public or lying or not talking about things or being it just felt dishonest to me, and I didn't feel like that was correct. And I mean, lots of people disagreed with me, and lots of people thought it was a bad faith decision by me, and were very cranky about it. There are people who are still cranky about it some years on, and but I still stand by it, and I still believe it was ethically the right decision to do. I'm not very good at being dissembling, all that kind of stuff. I'm just not very good at that. You know that very well. And so it was the right decision in terms of being honest with people and about where I was at and what I believed in. And it certainly freed me up in terms of both time, but also in terms of being able to make decisions that accorded with my own beliefs, rather than having to check in with a party position.
That's really interesting. As an extension of that, you're also a visibly disabled person.
Yes.
And so that, you're talking there about being, jargon terms, your authentic self. That thing where you talk about ethically, you talk about being, you, so that you're not actually being asked to do something publicly that doesn't sit with you well. If we extend that into the disability space, you're also doing that as a disabled woman. So how did you find that position of responsibility in the community and representing both your community and a party, and being, in a sense, open for anybody to really approach you about anything and make any claim about you, which is what public life does?
Yes.
When you tack your disability onto that space, how did that work for you?
I didn't. So, disability issues weren't the reason I resigned from the Greens, but they contributed to that in terms of their lack of accessibility certainly made doing my role within the Greens very difficult. But council was much less accessible, and so I had to push hard for really basic access stuff. There was so the council chambers are on the second floor of the council building, and that's the only level that's open in the evenings when council meetings are held. So, and the lift always broke down. So it quite often was left unrepaired for long periods of time. So I had no access to the building. There also was no accessible toilet on that level. And the briefings were held in a place that wasn't accessible for me. And I was given there was no facility made available to me to be able to participate in that. So I was constantly at a disadvantage in terms of access to information, access to the building even. And, the lift would break down halfway through the council meeting, for example, and I would freak out because I'd like, how on earth do I get out of here? And people were the staff were very antagonistic around my distress and my upsetness around that, and found it very difficult that I was critical of the council about the lack of access. And some of them seemed to take it as a personal insult, and I'm kind of like, I don't care, just fix this, And they did fix it in the end, but it was a real fight to get that kind of access. And people were so. By the last year and a half of council, my illness had relapsed, and I was, again, very visibly disabled and physically not able to get around and do those kind of things. And I live in a small town, and there was a lot of kind of rubbish said about me and my capabilities and those kind of things. And it was pretty difficult. And the council infrastructure certainly didn't help that, and the politics of the council certainly didn't help that. And even now, I had someone say to me the other day, not in a nice way, I don't think people realised how sick you actually were, and that they really shouldn't have said those things about you. And I'm kind of like, well, that's really not a nice thing to say. But also, I'm not stupid. I'm very well aware of that. And I got a lot of very negative feedback from people about the way I looked. I was often told that I was too sick to be a counsellor and that I should just resign, and I refused. And I feel that stuff very strongly around chronic illness and disability shouldn't preclude you from representative or public life. And I was often told to be quiet and to hide and to take my disabled self away, and particularly when I was very visibly sick and I used a walking stick and all of that kind of stuff, and people found that ridiculous. So people had very strong reactions to it and were profoundly problematic around it in terms of what was said and about me publicly. Look, not everyone, and a lot of the other councillors were fantastic, and the mayor and other councillors made significant accommodations for me, which was fantastic. But that shouldn't have been the exception. That should not have been something. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where I felt like I was back in the old days where it was about me as an individual being damaged and broken rather than the structures being profoundly anti people with disability. And it became very difficult. And I certainly, when I got to the end of my term, I was very relieved to finish. And I was pretty distressed about the whole experience at the end of it. I mean, it was an honour to serve my community, and I feel very grateful to have had the chance to get to know so many fantastic people and to bring their concerns to the table and feel like I could advocate for them and for what they wanted. And that was a huge honour. So I don't want to take away from any of that stuff, but it certainly came at a personal cost for me, and it wasn't something that I have been pretty upfront about that since, and I have been pretty upfront about for other disabled people, particularly other disabled women who've contacted me and wanted to talk to me about this. I have said, be careful. Like, really, local government in my experience, was not something that I found particularly open or welcoming to people with disability. And so even down to the basic accommodations that, I wouldn't think twice about being able to get at work, but in this environment, it just seemed like the world's worst disaster, and people thought I was asking for special favours and that kind of stuff. And it was, I ended up having to threaten a Human Rights Commission complaint to actually get access to some of the information that the other councillors got. So it was just it really was quite extraordinary. And
this is all within the last decade.
Oh yeah. This is not, the 1980s. This is and that's what, that's one of the things that freaked me out. I mean, even the whole accessible living on the council floor, I was kind of like, did you not think that disabled people ever came to council? Like, did it just not occur to you that we might actually participate in local democracy? No, it had never actually occurred to them that might actually happen. So
what, because we're now running out of time, but what would you say your key learning about that period in being in government was for you?
I think that I wasn't ready, and I think that that's okay to say, that I really was unprepared and really didn't understand the workload or was very ready to represent my community. I think that it is an honour and it is a privilege to be asked to do that representative role, but you need to be very ready and you need to want to do it. And ending up in it by accident, like I did, was not a good idea. And I so there's that. But I learnt that government can be much more accessible to the community in terms of everything, to everyone, not just disabled people. And often things are made obtuse and difficult on purpose, and that annoys me. So I think that things can be communicated much more clearly and processes can be much easier for people to engage with than they are. And I think that often things around public consultation are absolutely given lip service when that needs to be at the heart of how we develop policy and how we make good decisions. I think treating the public as a hostile entity is a bad idea, and councillors, as the representatives, elected representatives of the public, are often treated that way by local government staff and officials. And I think that is a shame, and a really there needs to be more local democracy, not less. And as powers keep getting devolved from councils, I think that it reduces the capacity for local organisations, local communities to be able to have a say about the things that matter to them.
Yeah. And before we wrap up, who's a leader that you admire and why?
Oh, that's really hard. Well, I don't think about leadership in the way that you do. And I know you and I have talked about this a lot, where I think that leaders in the community are better. I'm not a fan of that kind of public leadership stuff, and that's just my personal principle.
So what's your pick of a leader, and
Okay.
why do you admire them? Yeah.
All right. Well, I think Jane Rosengrave is someone that I hugely admire. So,
fantastic. She's marvellous. Yes.
Yeah. So Jane is an amazing woman with disability who lives in Victoria. She has been an extraordinary advocate for the Royal Commission into violence against people with disability, particularly women with disability who've lived in institutions like she did, and against domestic violence and family violence for women with disability. So she is someone that I have had the privilege of meeting, and I hugely admire her guts and her ability to be very frank, and her tireless activism. She is just she has done a huge amount in the last sort of 4 or 5 years around progressing the agenda about justice for disabled women, and Jane is someone I hugely admire.
Fantastic. And we have seriously run out of time. Elle Gibbs, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been great to have you along.
My absolute pleasure, Christina.
Okay.